In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be starting a new series where I take some of my PvE builds and convert them into PvP variants so that you can use them in the new Colosseum update. We'll go through 3 builds in each one of these videos. I'll try and get one out or so a week in order to showcase these, and I'll show you like what I've changed and what strategies seem to work for me in the arena. Keep in mind, these are not meta builds. I am not a PvP specialist, but I do want to show you how some of these builds can work so that if you like these builds, you can take them into the arena with a couple tweaks and still get some victories. So first up, we're going to take a look at the Crimson Duelist build. If you remember, this is a build that uses Roger's Rapier to apply bleed to enemies and bosses really quickly, hitting rapidly, using the R2 attack. And I've changed it up a bit here since this was nerfed a little bit. Seppuku was nerfed in an update, the last update. So what I've done now is I've set it to the bleeding affinity, and I've put Royal Knight's Resolve on it. I have a shield in my offhand, mostly for buffs, because the shield has some status effect resistance. And I also have the Dragon Communion Seal here, which I use to cast Swarm of Flies. When it comes to the equipment, I've got Millicent's Prosthesis, I've got Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, I've got the Spear Talisman, and I've got the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Obviously, the first two are there to increase your damage as you hit rapidly. I've got the Spear Talisman there to increase our counter damage. A lot of times you trade damage with Thrust, and you're going to get more damage when you do this. And then the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman is there for further protection. I've also swapped out my armor to give us more poise, because as you're attacking repeatedly, you don't want to be interrupted in order to get those hits off and build up bleed. So the strategy here is quite simple. You're going to use Swarm of Flies to pressure enemy, and they usually do one of two things, depending on what their build is or what they've decided to do. They're either going to rush you through the Swarm of Flies, or they're going to back away and try and wait out Swarm of Flies. Now you can cast this repeated times to keep pressure on them. And while Swarm of Flies is up, if they back away, you're going to want to buff with Royal Knight's Resolve, and you're going to want to press them. The idea is you need to get close with Roger's Rapier. It is not a long-range weapon. It has shorter reach than a lot of weapons, so you need to get close. So you're going to use Swarm of Flies to sort of pressure them, get them to back up a bit, and then hopefully kill them while Swarm of Flies is on them. Maybe it staggers them a little bit and gets a little bit of bleed build up, and then you trigger the bleed with R2. Now, if they pressure you, what you want to do is go immediately into that R2 combo so that hopefully you stop them in their tracks, even if you trade damage, and that the Swarm of Flies comes back and catches up with them. Hopefully this triggers bleed, which gives you another opportunity to pull off another R2, and you can rip off a huge chunk of health right away. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of variances to builds that you'll face against this, but that's the general strategy. It's a bit cheesy, but I will just say that PvP in this game is cheesy. If you're not playing cheesy for PvP in this game, you won't win. There are just too many sweaty people that have sweaty builds, and if you don't play in a sweaty manner using things like Swarm of Flies, you will lose most of your fights. When it comes to stats, the main changes here are that we have 60 Vigor. This is to help you trade blows and still live. The higher Vigor you can get here, the better. This is as much as I wanted to go. And obviously, we've switched Arcane for Dexterity here. I have 85 because I have Millicent's Prosthesis equipped. This should probably be 80, so if you want to remove 5 points and put them somewhere else, like into more Vigor, that's not a bad idea, or maybe more Endurance, you can roll more. That's not bad. We have a little bit of faith in Arcane in order to cast Swarm of Flies, but otherwise, it's pretty much a Dexterity Vigor build. And the reason we've swapped out Royal Knight's Resolve here from Seppuku, because Seppuku only lasts about a minute. It takes damage off yourself to use, and it's been nerfed heavily. So it's not going to be very good in a PvP fight. You don't want to take health off yourself if you can help it. The animation is long. You're not going to be able to rebuff with it in combat. So Royal Knight's Resolve is just better here. It allows you to trade and get more damage because Rapiers in general don't have a ton of damage. So the next build I'm going to showcase here is the Crucible Knight build. This is the build where we sort of cosplay the Crucible Knight. We used Ordovis' Great Sword, and we used the incantations of the aspect of the Crucible. And I didn't really have to change too much for this build. It works pretty effectively. You have plenty of poise. You have a good, powerful weapon skill in Ordovis' Vortex. And you have a few different spells at your disposal. You can buff with Golden Vow at the beginning of fights to give yourself more protection and more damage. And you have Aspect of Crucible's Tail, which I find very good in like large-scale battles, but otherwise very unuseful. And the Aspect of Crucible Horns can catch people off guard from behind sometimes if you're fighting like multiple enemies. Like maybe you're coming up behind someone, you charge and get into them, it launches them into the air. And when they're sort of getting up from that, you can mess them up. But the one I find very, very effective with this build is the Aspect of Crucible's Breath. This thing is absolutely great. A lot of times enemies can just dodge your attacks if they are a good player. Sometimes they might even troll you doing that, as you'll see in this footage here. But this fire, they can't dodge. You can even use this thing point blank. And what I like to do with targets is get up close to them where they can't roll away fast enough, and then cast this poise through it with our poise and just absolutely melt them. This works better when there are more enemies caught in it, so if you're playing in a group setting, it's even better. But if not, you can just absolutely mess somebody up. What I really like about Ordovis's Vortex for PvP is the fact that it has different cast speeds depending on how long you charge this or don't charge this. So for instance, if you use it regularly, players will become accustomed to it, they'll learn when you're using it, and they'll wait for it to finish and then they'll run in. Well, maybe you charge it every so often so that they gamble with thinking it's going to be a regular cast speed, they roll in, and then they dodging through what they think would be the explosion, but then because you held it a second longer, now they go into the attack, and you get off the Ordovis's Vortex, and it hits them for even more damage because it's charged, pancakes them, and then you can get some more attacks on them with maybe Breath or something like that, which is fantastic. It also works really well in a group setting because it's an AoE, 360 degrees, so if somebody's chasing you from behind, then you go up to cast it, and they don't stagger you with their attack, even if you don't see them, they will get hit by this, which benefits you a lot. As far as equipment goes, I'm using the Crucible Knight's armor here. This is because it gives you the, aspect of Crucible incantation damage, extra damage. You get about 14-15% or so from wearing all the pieces. Has very good poises, very good protection. It's stylish. You're a Crucible Knight. It's fun. We have the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Protection wins fights in these matchups. So the more protection you have, the better. Shard of Alexander, obviously, to increase Ordovis Vortex damage. Godfrey Icon for charged Ordovis's Vortex. All three of these spells are also chargeable, so if you charge them up, they'll increase damage. And then I also have kind of a flex spot. You can do the Claw Talisman here if you do jump attacks a lot. I have the Fire one here. I've been experimenting with it, the Fire Scorpion Charm, in order to increase my breath damage. It does make you take more damage, so it's not one I super advise, but I was kind of testing it out. It seems to be okay. Like, you're not going to die real easily. But if you're having a tough time staying alive, I'd recommend swapping that out for something else. This build is not the greatest duelist build, in my opinion. It's not a great one-on-one build, but it really does well or better in a group setting where you're 2v2, 3v3, or free-for-all. Because of the AoE nature of a lot of these spells and because they hit very hard, if you can get some people to focus on somebody else for a second, you can do really, really well with it. Regarding for the stats for this build, I really haven't changed much. All I did was take some points out of Faith and put them into Vigor just to keep me alive a little bit more, especially since I have the Fire Scorpion Charm. But otherwise, we haven't really changed much. The stat spread is pretty much identical to what we're using in the PvE build, so really you can take your PvE build into PvP with this, and you should be able to do just fine. It is not an easy build to use in 1v1 settings, as I mentioned, but in group play, it's fantastic. And lastly, we have the Death Mage build. This is a caster build that's intelligence-based, although it can use Faith as well later on in NG+, that focuses on the use of death sorceries. This build works very, very well in PvP. Ancient Death Ranker tracks enemies really crazily, and it was patched in 1.07 to track them even longer. And you can absolutely just abuse this in combat. It's kind of cheesy, but frankly, the amount of cheese I've seen in the arena so far, fight cheese with cheese is what I say. So you're going to want to spam this. And it basically, again, not unlike the Crimson Duelist build, using the Swarm of Flies ability, it's going to pressure enemies to either come at you or to run away from you. If they run away from you, they're kind of screwed. They can only, stay away for so long, and if you're playing this like in a group setting, eventually somebody else is going to clip them while they're rolling away. So, unless they're just rolling and rolling and rolling forever, most players will make a mistake sooner or later, and they'll take damage from this spell. So even if you exhaust all your FP, and you've chugged a flask, and, your enemies are down to, like, half health, you took off half their health before they even got to you. Now, on the contrary, if players are aggressive and they come at you, which is really the best way to play against this build, so if you see someone using this strategy, you should charge them. That's the best thing you can do, obviously, avoiding the skulls while you do it. But if they come at you, you really have two options. You can try and trade with your, Knight in Flame sword, which I don't recommend. Usually they have a bigger, stronger weapon than you, or they're dual wielding. You're going to lose that trade. You'll take more damage than you'll deal. Or you can do what I do and two-hand your staff real quick, which is the Carrion Regal Scepter. That's the one we're using here. And use Spinning Weapon. They don't see this coming most of the time. And this hits like a truck, especially if you have something like Shard of Alexander equipped. It does an absolute shitload of damage when they get into it, and they get staggered, usually, and caught in it. And if you spam this like twice in a row, you usually finish them off, especially if you have skulls still trailing them while they get caught in this. Other than that, we have Fia's Mist. This is very, very situational. You're not going to use this all the time. You can use this against aggressive enemies, but I find this better in like a group setting. You won't use it all the time, but we have it here. We also have Ricard's Rancor. I find this really good to lead with in combat a lot of times if enemies are aggressive, if you know that they're going to push you, because they usually won't push into this the way that they'll push into Ancient Death Ranker. So it's another good option if enemies are pushing you. Throw this out first, then throw out Ancient Death Ranker to keep enemies away from you while you can start your spam. And you'll obviously want to drop Terra Magic at the beginning of the fight. If you can, this is going to buff your Ancient Death Ranker. We also have Explosive Ghost Flame in here. I don't use it that often, but you could use it in a group setting if you find a good situation for it. Now, the reason we're using the Carrion Regal Scepter here instead of the Prince of Death Staff is we don't have the stats. In PvP, you have to have way more vigor than you do in PvE. And if you look at the build in PvE. We have way lower vigor, so we can get away with putting more stats into Faith, because you're not going to get hit as much in PvE, but in PvP, you're going to get hit. There's no getting away from it, particularly if you're playing against multiple people in like a group setting or free-for-all. So we had to crank vigor up here quite a bit. And you also want a good amount of FP here, too. These aren't expensive spells, but you don't have that many flasks, so you're not going to, like, you know, have a lot of flasks to use unless you're doing a duel, which in that case you'll have plenty. But if you're playing in a group setting where you only have one flask, you're not going to have a ton, so you need some FP to go through before you have to chug a pot. This way we get the absolute most damage out of our spells, and if you take this build much higher, like 20 or 30 levels higher, you can probably use the Prince of Death Staff no problem, and you'll get a little bit more damage out of it, and then if you go even higher to like 200, you'll get much more damage, so that's a good option there. When it comes to armor, we have Fia's armor set for her helm and chest, very lightweight. I like the style of this, there's no real reason to use it besides the style. And then I have the Black Knife gloves, and I have the Bull Goat's legs, and the reason for that is people cannot see very easily beneath your road. So this way you actually hit the 56 poise breakpoint. So when they come at you, they're not expecting you to have enough poise to withstand their attack if you catch them with spinning weapon or you catch them with an R1. And that can catch them off guard. That's a really good strategy in PvP to sort of, you know, not telegraph what you're going to do. And this set just covers your armor so they can't see that you're going to have that poise. We use the Bull Goat's Talisman to make up the rest of the poise here. That way we can tank a hit. Other than that, we have the Graven Mask Talisman to further increase our damage with spells, Shard of Alexander to increase spinning weapon and the abilities of the Sword of Night and Flame, and we have Godfrey Icon in case you charge up Ancient Death Ranker. That'll give it more damage. You can use something else here if you want, like Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman's not a bad choice as well to give you a little extra defense. So the Sword of Night and Flame is just kind of your option when things get close to you. You can't always just pull a spell out of your ass at the last possible second, and you can't always swap to spinning weapon on a moment's notice. So this is a good option to just get regular melee attacks, whether they're like running melee attacks or jumping melee attacks. You're not going to use it that often. You're primarily a caster here, but it is a good alternative. So that wraps up our first video showcasing how some of our builds that we've made that are PvE builds can be PvP builds with a little bit of tweaks. And again, I'm not claiming these are meta builds or the best builds for PvP, but I just wanted to show that they are viable if you know what you're doing and you know how to make adjustments to them. I also want to say that we do have more PvE builds coming and more weapon videos coming for those of you who are panicking, who haven't seen a lot of Elden Ring content on the channel recently, or are now that see the PvP patch or thinking, oh no, it's just going to be PvP builds. That's not the case. I am a PvE player. I'm a co-op player more than a PvP player in this game. I hardly PvP at all. But I do think that there is a case here to make some PvP content for those who enjoy that sort of content, and also to showcase some of the builds we have and show that they are viable in PvP. So you can look forward to more PvE content, more weapon videos, as well as a couple PvP videos here and there. Let me know what builds you guys are using. How are you finding the Colosseum? Is it something you're enjoying? It can be frustrating at times, and other times it's a lot of fun. It's kind of a mixed bag depending on what's going on. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.